Hello friend, welcome back to my channel. How are you today? I hope you're doing well. It's Tim here, and in this video, I'm going to guide you through the steps to create this Impressionist-inspired landscape painting. Impressionism is definitely one of my favorite painting styles of all time, and I've been looking for the perfect brush to use for this tutorial for a while, so I'm so excited to finally be able to share it with you. If you recreate this painting and are on Instagram, I would absolutely love to see it, so please tag me at TimStarStudio. Upcoming here are the hex codes for the palette of colors that you'll need to be able to paint along with me, as well as the brushes we're going to use for this tutorial. And for the damp brush, I do have a video up on my channel on how to recreate this brush from scratch, so if you need it, definitely go check it out. The first step of this tutorial will be to screenshot this trace outline layer, and then fit it into a square size canvas on Procreate, and then trace over it into a blank layer. I recommend using the technical pen to do that too, it's the easiest one to use. The first part of this painting will be laying out all of our colors down, and then the second part will be blending it out. Please feel free to take any breaks that you might need along the way, and when you're ready, let's begin. Alright, so getting into the tutorial. Let's turn our trace layer down to about 9 to 10% opacity. Let's add a new layer and put it underneath of our trace outline. Now, using the first color in the first row, the sapphire shade of blue, let's fill in the entire canvas with this color. Let's add a new layer. Now, using the soft airbrush with full size and full opacity, using the second color in the first row, let's lay a stripe of this new color about 1 inch below the top edge of the canvas, leaving just a little strip of that darker blue color still across the top. I would definitely recommend using a really light hand to layer colors down with as well. That way the background color still kind of shows through a little bit. And I would actually recommend doing this for all of the colors that we're about to lay down here for the sky. That way we have a little bit more color variegation to play with later on. Next, using the third color in the first row, we're going to place another stripe of color underneath the first, just like this. Then, using the fourth color in the first row, let's place another thin stripe of color underneath the last. Now let's use the sixth color in the first row, and let's change our brush size to about 48% so it's a little bit smaller. And then let's place a thin strip of green color between the second and the third color like this. Next, using Gaussian blur, let's blur this layer to about 38%. After you get this blurred out, let's make a copy of this layer. Next, let's add a new blank layer and switch over to using the damp brush, about 8% size and full opacity. Which brings us to painting the clouds. So here I wanted to share the types of paint strokes we're going to be using for this next section. We will be switching between using a loose circular paint stroke and more of a scrubbing paint stroke, and then kind of combining the two in different places. Using the fifth color in the first row, the color white. Now, using circular scrubbing paint strokes, let's begin to paint our first cloud over top of our trace outline in the upper left-hand corner. And then we're going to paint another cloud underneath, just like this. And then a third cloud in the middle top edge area, like this. And one right underneath, taking the fourth one up to the edge. Now let's switch over to using the blending tool with the damp brush, about 11% size and 34% opacity. And then we're going to blend with loose, circular paint strokes, kind of turning each cloud into a misty form, not really worrying too much about their shape yet. And we're going to repeat this for all of the clouds. Let's add a new layer and put it into soft light. Using the sixth color in the fourth row, the shade of black. Still about 8% size and full opacity, we're going to lay some color underneath the entire sky area, just like this. Then using the blending tool with the damp brush, about 15% size and 30% opacity, with loose scrubbing paint motions, we're going to lightly blend out this new color. And we're not completely blending this color away into the background, but we're just kind of softening up all of the hard edges. And when you're happy with your blending, we're going to add some more cloud color and shadow. Let's add a new layer. Using the fifth color, the color white, in the first row again with the damp brush. Repeating the same steps as before, we're going to lay white color down across our trace outline for each of our clouds. Now using the first color in the second row, using about 5% size and full opacity, we're going to lay a thin strip of this gray color with back and forth scrubbing paint strokes on the undersides of each of our clouds. Then switching over to the blending tool with 10% size and 34% opacity. Using light, loose scrubbing motions, we're going to loosely blend out all of our clouds. And when blending these ones out, we're not blending these out quite as much as we did the ones before it, but we're still not worrying too much about their shape. Just kind of marrying and buffing out all of these new cloud colors and textures back together into the background. I'm going to turn the trace outline off for just a moment. And we're going to continue blending these out, just getting rid of any harsh edges that might be left behind. When you're happy with your blending, I'm going to go ahead and make a copy canvas layer. And then I'm going to merge all of our layers back into one. Which then brings us to painting the background island area. Let's turn our trace outline back on. Let's add a new layer. Let's switch over to the paintbrush with the water pen. Using the second color in the second row. Using about 5% size and full opacity, let's fill in our back island outline area just like this. And then I'm going to fill in these two little background areas between the trees with this color. And then we're going to finish filling in the right-hand side, which will finish turning the background island into background trees. Now to paint the trees. Let's add a new layer. Using the water pen with about 5% size and full opacity, using the second color in the fourth row, let's fill in each of our trees with this new color. And here I'm going to make my brush size just a little bit bigger here, that way it's a little bit easier to fill in. When you get them filled in, let's add a new layer. Now using the fifth color in the second row, we're going to place a line of this blue color in each of the centers of each of the front trees, but I'm not going to put any of this blue color on the very back two trees. Then using the sixth color in the second row, I'm going to lay a stripe of this color on both sides of each stripe of blue we just laid down, just like this. And let's actually put a little bit of this green color on the back two trees now. And then finish up with the two on the right. Then using the first color in the third row, I'm going to place a thin stripe of this color around each tree edge. Then using the second color in the third row, we're going to place a stripe of color on the left side of each of the front 3 trees. And then on both edges of the 2 far right trees like this. Then using the third color in the third row, let's repeat the same steps as before, only putting a slightly thinner stripe of color on each of the front 5 trees. Next, using the fourth color in the third row, we're going to put a very thin, short stripe of color on top of each of the same trees, just like this. Now let's switch over to using the blending tool with the water pen, about 13% size and 80% opacity. Let's merge our tree highlight layer and base color tree layer together. And I'm going to take the water pen using short up and down zigzag paint motions to blend our tree out. And here I wanted to share what the paint strokes actually are going to look like and then what it looks like blended out on the tree itself. And this is just to do a little pre-blending for our colors for part 2, which will make it so much easier for us later on. So now using these short up and down random zigzag like paint strokes, we're going to lightly blend the colors we just laid down from earlier together to kind of marry all of the colors together and to create a little bit of texture. And when I reach these front trees, I'm actually going to exaggerate my paint strokes out just a little bit more than the ones in the back, just to create a little bit more dramatic texture to play with. And by chance, if any of your colors end up getting blended away too much during the process, you can always use the eyedropper tool to color grab to add them back in. And when you're happy with your blending, we're going to start laying down the colors for our field. Let's add a new layer and put this layer underneath of our tree layer. Using the fifth color in the fourth row, let's outline the edges of both sides of the field. Then let's fill both sides of the field in with the same color. Now in the next upcoming steps, we're going to be layering colors down with short and choppy paint strokes that are all kind of layered on top of each other to create a gradient in a way that's still allowing all of the colors to still show through but not letting any one color take over. Let's add a new layer. So using the fourth color in the third row, let's place a thin stripe of this light yellow beige color on the top edge of both sides of the field. Now we're going to use short up and down zigzag paint strokes that are meant to look kind of choppy, and using the fifth color in the third row, let's paint another row of color directly underneath of the previous color, just like this. Now using the sixth color in the third row, let's place another stripe of color underneath the last on both sides like before. And this is where I'm going to start being a little bit looser with the paint strokes, really allowing some of the undercolors to show through. And now using the first color in the fourth row, we're going to lay another stripe of color right below it. And we're going to make it slightly thinner up here as we get up into the corner. And then we're going to place it on the left-hand side as well. Now using the second color in the fourth row, let's repeat the same step as before. Now using the first color in the third row, let's place some random, singular short, up and down paint strokes in random places on both sides of our field, just like this. Now using the sixth color in the third row, we're going to repeat the same steps, putting a couple of singular strokes in random places on both sides. And then repeating the step with the third color in the third row. And then repeating this same step with the second color in the third row. Placing this color just a little bit closer to the middle and bottom areas of the canvas. Now using the third color in the fourth row, we're going to repeat the same step, only putting this color closer to the very bottom of the canvas around the left side edge, and then the bottom area of the right hand side of the field, just like this. And then we're going to repeat the same step with the fifth color in the second row, only using slightly shorter and smaller paint strokes now, just like this, to really start defining our edge line. And then repeating this with the first color in the first row, that bright shade of blue, only even more sparingly now. Let's add a new layer, and we're going to put this layer underneath of the two grass layers, which will make it easier to paint the path. And now it's time to paint the sea in the pathway. Using the fourth color in the fourth row, still with the water pen about 46% size and full opacity, we're going to completely fill in the pathway area. Then using the third color in the second row with about 6% brush size and full opacity, let's fill in the sea area with this color. When you get the ocean area filled in, let's add some details to our pathway. Now let's add a new layer. Using the fifth color in the fourth row, we're going to paint a little stripe of color around both edges of the pathway like this, allowing a little bit of that yellow color to still be in between. And then I'm going to turn this layer down to about 57%. Let's add a new layer. Using the second color in the fourth row, we're going to fill in the middle strip of color on the outline, using the same zigzag paint strokes that we used for the grass. And then with the first color in the fourth row, using random up and down zigzag paint strokes, we're going to place a little bit of this highlight color on top of the previous color, allowing a little bit of the back color to still show through. Then using the fifth color in the third row, we're going to place smaller paint strokes over top of the previous color like this. Now to paint the boats. Using 2% brush size with the water pen and with the fifth color in the first row, the color white, let's add a new layer and put it over top of the trace outline so it'll be easier to see. Let's trace over our boat outlines and fill each sailboat in. Here I accidentally extended the line of the ground a little bit too far, so if this happens to you, we're going to go back to the grass and the ground layer in the layers and merge the two together, and then with the eraser tool we're going to clean up the edges a little bit, just to extend the edge of the sea downwards a little bit so the boats aren't floating on the ground. Now let's move the trace outline back to the top, and now it's time to add some highlights. Let's make a copy canvas layer and then make a duplicate of it so there are now going to be two copy canvas layers. The top of the two layers, using hue and saturation, we're going to put it into black and white. Let's add a new layer and put it into overlay. Using the fifth color in the first row and the damp brush, we're going to use about 4 to 5% in size and about 75% opacity. We're going to start by putting just a little bit of highlight on the front three trees and then a little bit on the right two, focusing most of the highlight on the left side where the sun would be hitting it. And then we're going to place some along the back edge line. Then we're going to put a little bit of highlight over each of the clouds again. Then let's add a little bit of this highlight to the backfield area, and then to the left side as well. And then to the middle areas of the pathway, just like this. And then here I decided to define the edges of our front three trees and the right trees a little bit more, so I added a little bit more highlight onto both sides. And when you're happy with your highlights, let's switch over to the blending tool now with the damp brush, about 12% size and 26% opacity, and let's lightly blend and buff out all of these new highlights. Just kind of marrying them all into the background. And if you need to adjust your opacity a little bit higher here and there, feel free to. I adjusted it here to about 42% and then just continued to blend and soften things up. And then when you're happy with your blending, let's turn the opacity of this new highlight layer down to about 59%. So now that we have the foundation of our painting created, that brings us to part 2. In this section, we'll be blending out all of our colors and creating all of our impressionist textures. Alright, so to get into part 2. So for this section, we'll be using the turpentine brush from the painting section, which has been a really huge surprise and kind of a game changer because it's not a brush that I ordinarily use at all until recently. And I actually just used it by chance during some experimentations for this painting, not really expecting much, but as I started blending with it, I really quickly realized that I had seriously misjudged this brush because it ended up blowing away all of my expectations for it. It's funny sometimes things will sit in your toolbox of stuff and be completely useless to you until it has the exact purpose for what you need it for, and those aha moments make painting so magical. This brush makes it so easy to make textures with and to smooth areas out in a way that looks very realistic and similar to a traditional medium oil painting. So I am super excited to share this with you, so when you're ready, let's begin. Let's make a copy canvas layer, and then a duplicate of it so there's going to be 2 of them. Now let's use the paintbrush now with the turpentine brush, which can be found in the painting section. About 4% brush size and about 69 to 70% opacity. And using back and forth, short, almost scribble-like paint strokes, starting on the right-hand side top corner, let's begin to blend and add texture to our painting, following the curves of the sky and the clouds. I did also find it helped to kind of have all of the paint strokes slightly tilted to the right for whatever reason, and then occasionally threw in different directions here and there. And feel free to experiment with the direction of the paint strokes too. You can have a lot of fun with this brush. And then continue this process across the rest of the sky, just like this. And feel free to pause to catch up at any time. There's a lot of painting in this section, but this is really where the painting comes to life at. And when you're happy with your sky and have reached the sea area, let's shrink our brush size down to around 3%. And let's blend over our mountain edge area following the shape and line of the land, just like this. And then let's add a little bit of grass texture across the top grass edge area. Now let's add some texture to the boats. And now shrinking our brush size down to around 2% or so, and increasing our opacity to around 90%, let's follow the shape of our sailboats and lightly blend and add texture to them, just like this. And let's repeat this step for the second sailboat. And now let's add a little bit more texture to the top of the grass area, just like this. Which brings us to blending out the left side field. So in this section upcoming here, we'll be using a W-shaped scribble-like zigzag to blend with, just like this. And then I wanted to show you what it looks like blending multiple colors together and then adding a couple of single random paint strokes here and there to add detail texture. So when you're ready, let's increase our brush size to around 3 or 4% and then increase our opacity up to around 91%. So now using these new paint strokes, I'm going to start here at the top and adjust the pathway just a little bit. And then we're going to start to blend, and we're going to work in rows, alternating from moving left to right and right to left. And let's blend out our field just like this. Repeating the same step down to the bottom. And I do find with the turpentine brush, it's not that it fades off a whole lot and it doesn't trail off, it just becomes a little bit softer the longer the paint stroke goes. So by lifting it up more, you will create some harder, more choppy textures. So if you want to create some more textured strokes, I would definitely lift the brush up a little bit more often to create a little more distinction between the rows. Which brings us to blending out the right side field and the trees. Now for blending out the trees, we're going to be using the random W-shaped zigzag again, kind of flaring out the edges just a little bit more though. It'll be just a little bit more exaggerated than what we did on them from earlier. And by lifting the brush too, you can create some really nice impasto inspired paint strokes really easily on these trees. And we're going to start blending this section by adding just a little bit of texture to the background tree color area in between right here. Now I'm going to shrink my brush size down to around 2%, still around 90 to 95% opacity. And now using our W-shaped paint strokes in random patterns, let's start blending out our trees. And now I'm going to come back over here to the left side of trees, and we're going to blend out each tree individually going down the row. And I am going to blend out the field area right underneath of the smaller trees right here as we go down the line, just to make it a little bit easier since we are using a smaller brush in this part, but I'm not going to blend out the bigger part of the field on the right side until after we get our trees blended out. And the more random you make your patterns, as well as making sure to pick up the brush to reset the stamp pattern, you can create some really beautiful textures for your trees. Just continuing to repeat these same steps now on the bigger trees. Now on the trees that are getting bigger and closer to the front, starting around here, I am adding even more paint strokes for texture on these ones. These trees are bigger than the ones in the back and they're closer to the viewer, so they will naturally have more details the closer they get to the front. And I am also occasionally exaggerating my brush stroke a little bit more here and there. Really just trying to pull out some of the brighter colors of the highlight area of the one tree into the darker areas of the one next to it, kind of creating some more color and texture contrast between the two. And then here for this last tree, I'm going to increase the brush size back to around 4%. And it's definitely okay to allow some of the sky color to kind of mix in around the greens of the edges of each tree to kind of create a nice blend between the two. It creates a really nice unity between all of the colors. And then when you have the trees blended out, I'm going to move on to the rest of the field using the same paint strokes as before to blend out the right side, just like we did the left side. And if you need to adjust your paintbrush size to get in smaller areas, feel free to at any time. I went with a really bright blue for this painting because I knew when we went to blend everything together, a lot of the color saturation was going to start kind of disappearing. And that's why I love Procreate so much, because the colors blend so similarly to real oil paint. So I wanted to pair that blue next to a reddish mauve color, so when we blended them together, we would kind of get a more muted navy tone when it was blended that was still kind of vibrant. And then having that mauve in there too, when it's blended in with the greens, it'll kind of create a brownish color. And when you mix it with the blue, it'll create a really pretty soft shadow color for the edges that isn't too harsh. And when you have your right side field blended out, then it's time to move on to the pathway. Now for the upper part of the path, I'm going to use back and forth short side-to-side paint strokes to still add texture, but kind of keep the shape and direction of the pathway still smoother looking rather than choppy. And when I reach the upper middle portion of the path, I'm going to use really exaggerated side-to-side paint strokes, kind of repeating this across the way just to add texture throughout. And when you reach the grass in the middle area, we're just going to repeat the same steps as the grass in both of the field areas to blend it out with like before. And while coming back in here for the blending and adding some extra details for this part in the middle of the path, I'm just kind of going in and being a little bit wild about it, changing up the direction of the paintbrush here and there, still using short, exaggerated paint strokes, but I just wanted to add some kind of scraggly grass here in the middle since it's growing in the middle of the pathway. So when you're happy with your grass and the rest of your blending, it's time to move on to the final details. So in this upcoming section, we're going to be adding and blending out some finer details to our painting. So let's add a new layer. And let's switch over to using the turpentine brush now with the paintbrush. About 3% brush size with 70% opacity. Now using the second color in the third row on the left side middle grass area, let's start adding short little highlight grass strokes to brighten this area up, just like this. And now I'm going to incorporate some of these paint strokes along the right-hand side grass edge. And then in the middle area. Now using the fourth color in the fourth row, and very sparingly, let's add some small, short, singular highlight paint strokes along the upper edge of the left-hand side of the grass, and then bringing it downwards into the upper middle area. Let's add a little of this highlight to the upper right-hand side grass and middle grass area. And now here I accidentally used the color dropper and color dropped this low light color on the pathway to use. I really meant to stay on the palette, but I did it without thinking. So you can do the same on your own painting and then add it to your own painting, or you can skip this color. I just wanted to add a little bit of color texture to the path here. Then using the fifth color in the first row, let's add some horizontal and diagonal paint strokes in the center and around the edges of each of our clouds, just like this. Not adding too much, but we want to add just a little bit of this highlight texture to it. Then using the third color in the second row, let's add some of this aqua color along just the middle part of the sky area. Then using the second color in the third row, let's add some of this green to the trees, just periodically here and there, not completely overwhelming it. We just want to create some highlight. Then using the fifth color in the third row, let's add some of this highlight to the middle grass. And now let's shrink the brush size to around 2% or so with 90% opacity. And along the right hand side edge, and very sparingly, let's add some of this highlight to brighten up the shadow's edge. Then on the left side bottom edge, let's lightly add some highlight and bring it up to around the middle area, just like this. Now using the third color in the fourth row, let's lightly add some more of this mauve color to around the bottom left edge. And then on the right side edge curve, and then a little bit in the middle grass area. Then using the sixth and fifth color in the second row, let's add a little bit of these colors back to the front tree just to add a little bit more depth, and then a little bit to the middle and back trees as well. Now using the third color in the first row, let's add a little bit of this blue color to the sky, just a little bit here and there just to add a little bit of color variation. And now let's turn the opacity of this highlight layer down to around 81%. And now it's time to blend out all of our new details. Let's create another copy canvas layer to work off of. And now let's switch back over to the blending tool. And using about 3% brush size with full opacity, I'm going to start on the top right hand side in the sky area, and I'm going to start blending out all of our new details. Kind of working my way down from the right to the left using the same paint strokes we used from earlier. And with this style, you definitely don't want to blend out everything so smooth. Leaving a little bit of texture here and there will definitely help to add to the impressionist look of your painting. Working my way from the sky down to the trees and ground. And here around the edges of the pathway, I'm adding in some extra exaggerated, choppy back and forth paint strokes to kind of drag and blend some of the grass colors in with the pathway. This will help the two areas really blend together a little bit more seamlessly. And when I came back over here to blend, I decided it needed just a little bit more exaggeration in the paint strokes right around the edge of the pathway here too. Now let's add a new layer and put that layer into overlay. And using the fourth color in the fourth row, let's switch back over to using the paintbrush. And let's switch over to using the turpentine brush again with about 3% brush size with 75 to 80% opacity. And using short, small singular paint strokes again, let's lightly add some of this highlight color across the left side field. And then across the right side field and middle grass area, just like this. Now let's add some more color to the trees. And then we're going to turn the opacity of this highlight layer down to around 73%. And now I'm going to add just a little bit more highlight to the middle grass area. I wanted just a little bit more. And then a little bit to our clouds. All still using that same color. And when you're happy with your highlights, I'm going to create another copy canvas layer on the top. And then let's switch back over to the blending tool with the turpentine brush. And I'm going to be switching between a couple of different sizes of brush, between 3 and 4% and 80% opacity to full opacity. And feel free to play around with it because you can create some really cool and different effects with the brush with different sizes and strengths. And let's lightly blend out all of our new highlight details. Really focusing in on blending and creating color variations here and there with a good mix of soft and rough textures. And when you're happy with your blending, that brings us to the last couple steps of our painting. And I'm so excited for this last part. I really want to give our painting a really dreamy quality to it with the colors, so let's add a new layer. And we're going to use the first color in the first row, and we're going to fill the entire layer with this electric ultraviolet color, one of my absolute favorite colors too. And then we're going to put this layer into luminosity mode. And then we're going to turn the opacity of this layer down to around 15%. And this will help to really unify all of our colors together. It'll help soften up the yellows and really exaggerate those blues. Next, let's create a copy canvas of these two layers. And then I'm going to up the saturation to around 52%. And then I'm going to turn the hue down to around 48%. Now let's create a copy of this new layer, so there's two of them. And last, on this new copy layer, I want to use sharpen. So I'm going to sharpen our painting to around 49% or so to exaggerate some of our textures we created, and we're done. Now let's sign our painting. I wanted to thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed the tutorial and had fun painting along the way. This is definitely one of my favorite styles to paint in as well. And if you recreated this painting and are on Instagram, I would absolutely love to see it. So please tag me at Timstar Studio. I have a ton of other painting tutorials now up on my channel as well if you're still in a painting mood. And if you enjoyed this video and want to see more content like this, I invite you to like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps my channel out. I'm wishing you the best, and I'll see you in the next video, friend. Happy painting!